and welcome to a new LinkedIn Live and great panel that we have prepared for you today. We have some amazing guests and speakers. I will let Shub introduce all of them to you. She will be the moderator. I'm here just to set the scene a little bit. As you all know, at Alcott Global, we have in recent times, well, recent, not so recent, the last 1 or 2 years, we have been building the learning solutions, which is our attempt to upskill the industry. We have been told that this is a big requirement. Lots of companies are trying to keep up with the huge surge with new technologies, AI, ChatGPT. Will they take all of our jobs? What are we going to do? I'm not sure even us have an answer to that, but Shub has worked hard. We have put together an online academy, which is priceless, I would say. Of course, I'm biased, but priceless from a toolkit perspective, and it's professionals for professionals type of content on the different elements of supply chain. And today we will, and she will address a topic that has come across a lot as a big challenge in most supply chain organizations, which is how do you set up the whole structure to really be customer centric? I know beyond what everybody says, oh, we're focused on the customer, this, customer, that, but how do you do that in practice? And she has 3 amazing guests that bring many years, I think close to 100 years, I don't know, of experience together in supply chain to talk about that. So with that being said, I will let Shub, I'll pass it to her, ask a lot of questions and enjoy the next 1 hour, which I'm sure will be a great learning experience. Shub, over to you.
Thank you, Raju. Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's panel discussion on building customer-centric supply chains. My name is Shub Faujdar, Global Head of Learning Solutions at Alcott Global, and I will be your moderator for today. So this is a live event. Please feel free to chime in with your comments and questions as we go along. And for our viewers who are looking at this as a recording, please do ask your question in comments as well, and we'll see how we can get the answers to you. We have an esteemed panel today. So let me start by introducing Sandra MacQuillan. She is the former CSCO of Mondelēz International, and before that, CSCO of Kimberly-Clark. Welcome, Sandra.
Thank you. Nice to be here, Shub.
Very honored to have you here, Sandra. Our next guest is Tariq Farooq, former CSCO of Sanofi. Tariq spent 27 years of his career within FMCG with P&G and Danone before making the switch to pharma. Welcome, Tariq.
Hey, thank you. Nice to be here.
Great. And our final guest is Michael Corbo. He is the former CSCO of Colgate-Palmolive. Mike spent over 40 years with the organization, handling 18 roles across the supply chain and across various countries. Welcome, Mike.
Thank you, Shub. Happy to be here.
Fantastic. So let's just dive in. And, while we've heard a lot of generic definitions of what is a customer-centric supply chain, I would love to know from all of you, probably an example of how you defined a customer-centric supply chain and what were its key characteristics. So let's start with Sandra.
Yeah, so throughout my career, actually, certainly in the leadership roles, I've been very focused on the consumer and the customer. So I separate the two, the consumer being the final port of call and the customer being the conduit that we go through most of the time to actually supply to our consumers. So I've made our strategies with my teams all about consumer service and consumers and customers, put them right in the center of everything we do, like the bullseye. So we've had things like, basically being the best in customer service or consumer service around the globe. So putting that in as that, why are we here? Well, we're here to serve the consumer. If we don't serve the consumer, we're not here for anything because they buy the product. You make it that simple and clear. You then can measure against it in terms of what you do. And yes, there's obviously the classic on time and in full, not case fill. I think that's a redundant message now in terms of how we measure it, because we just abuse it and we measure what we want to measure in the supplier's point of view rather than the customer's. So we really need to measure it as the customer and the consumer measures service for us, and take the bad hits and take the good hits and learn. and use things like the Advantage survey and other surveys that actually talk about the depth of how you deliver on your service. So I have always made it the focus of, why are we here? Well, we're here to serve the consumer, because without the consumer, we're nothing. What do we need to do? Well, we need to do it in the right way. So you've got service, quality, cash, costs, sustainability, all those core key metrics that you would measure. And then to bring that to life to people in the strategies that you do internally in the company. So what's our value strategy in terms of cost and cash? What's our value strategy in terms of service? Those kind of things. I mean, I can go on forever, but I don't want to take any more time. That's not fair. But I do think that's what I believe in, is you start with the consumer at the center and you work back to the field. So take the data from the shelf and come back. Then execute on the data that you've been given and improve the shelf.
Fantastic. Thank you for opening this, Sandra, and we'll get into some of those pointers in a bit. But let's hear from Tariq next.
Yeah, look, I'll echo everything that Sandra has said and just build on it by saying, from my standpoint, when I think about, what's a consumer, patient, customer-centric supply chain, in its simplest terms, I think it's one that delivers to the customer what they want, when they want it, where they want it, how they want it, right? And as Sandra said, at the quality that they expect. And more they care also about the environmental impact that's driven as well. So that's the first thing. The second thing I would say is that a one-size-fits-all should not be what you drive for. Customers are all different. Their needs in terms of what, where, when, and how, as I just mentioned, are different. And if you're truly customer-centric, then you've set yourself up for that. And last but not least, and I'm sure we'll come back to this later on, customer needs and expectations evolve. And therefore, if you're a truly customer-centric supply chain, then your capabilities need to evolve and keep pace with that as well. So those would be my sort of add-ons to what Sandra just mentioned.
Fantastic. Mike.
Yeah, just to build on that, the first thing I think you need to do is set up some type of very consistent feedback from the customer and make sure because as Tariq said, it does change. And you can't assume what each customer wants, because that will change. We saw a lot of that since 2020 on, that things that were important before lost importance and others gained, because as you talk about the consumer, the person using your product, we get a lot of quality data. We want to understand that it's a consistent product, that consumers like it. And then, go to the shelf. I think on-shelf availability is key to getting your customer in sync with you, because that's where people buy the product. But you really do have to set up some type of, and it's not, the feedback is not haggling over deductions or fines either. That's not the feedback loop. It really is, how am I doing? What's important to you? And make sure you set up the supply chain to meet those needs.
I think if I may, Shub, I think that's fantastic from both of you, actually, because it is about having the courage, actually, to ask your consumers and customers what they really think. And I see a lot of supply chains that aren't supply chains. They're actually just manufacturing units that we can measure our output on versus what we actually need to have from a service point of view. And I think there's a very naive approach that we have in some parts of supply chains where they're not supply chains. They are still separated but silo functions. If we don't become supply chains and measure the service throughout the whole of the chain, from the shelf back to the supplier or the supplier to the shelf, we're never going to have customer service. And I think that's why it's taking us so long to do it. If I look at some of the reversals that we go through in our functions, people run away from on time and in full, even though it's only like a secondary level measure. In general, people run away from that because it's too difficult to do. But actually, you want it to be difficult as you progress it, and you want to have that feedback that Tariq and Mike are referring to. Otherwise, how do you change it? And I heard of somebody recently who dropped customer service from their tier 1 metrics, and I was just like holding my head, going, "What the hell? You know, this is the core of who we are to a certain extent. And if you don't make it to the right level in the right way, sustainably, all that, cost effectiveness and everything else, what are we doing?" So there's something not quite right yet in the psyche in supply chain, or even in manufacturing, if you take it to that level. Anyway, sorry, I just thought it was such a great point that the two of them were making, that it's huge and we underestimate it.
Fantastic there. Now, we've understood what really is customer-centric supply chain from your perspectives. I think it would be great for everyone to get a concrete example from all three of you. You worked in supply chain for, as Raju just said, combined 100 years, on how you have built a customer-centric supply chain and what was the overall impact on the business. So Tariq, let's start with you.
Yeah, first of all, as you keep saying 100 years between us, that does make me feel old, but putting that aside for a second. Look, I'll perhaps answer your question in terms of an example using life sciences, because I'm sure Sandra and Mike will talk a lot about FMCG. And as you said, I started in FMCG, but spent the last 5 years or so in life sciences. And just one piece of context, I think life sciences generally have done a fantastic job of developing drugs and getting them to patients. But I think it's fair to say that historically they've been less progressive when it comes to the innovations and the work that they've done on their supply chains. And that's not because they're not smart or they're not focused. It's simply because they've been in an environment with higher margins, less demanding customers, and therefore they haven't had to innovate as much. And the example I always give is, I remember when I was at Danone at P&G, when you were delivering to the likes of Walmart or Carrefour or whoever, they would give you a 30 minutes window in which you deliver into. And when I joined Sanofi and found that our windows were 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 4 weeks, a month, and many customers being happy if they ordered something on the first of the month and got it by the end of the month, it's a less demanding environment. But nevertheless, I think in terms of some of the things that we did at Sanofi, unashamedly reapplying a lot of the great work that folks like Sandra and Mike have done in FMCG over the years. So I don't want to make it sound too simple, but focused on driving that customer connection, that customer understanding of what they really need, segmenting the offerings and the service packages you give to your customers based on what they need versus what you think they may need, because not all customers are created equal. Doing basic things like CPFR, which has been around forever, but I think not everybody does it as well as they could or should. Bringing in some basic technologies. I mean, I was surprised when I joined Sanofi, for example, that we still took orders in some cases via fax machine. And I didn't realize fax machines still existed in 2017, 2018, but some of our orders still came in via fax machines, because in hospitals, the procurement folks were not having all the tools that others might have, and they had a fax machine and they write their orders down and it gets faxed through. So shifting to using the basics of EDI, web portals and so on to capture your orders. And then also back to my point earlier about delivering to customers and patients and consumers how they want, we did a lot of work on enabling home deliveries, which became increasingly important, particularly over the COVID period, as you can imagine, because if you're a patient with a cardiovascular condition or even diabetes or whatever, the last thing that you want to have to be doing is going into a hospital where you're going to be perhaps exposed to COVID where you don't need to. So we did a lot of work on those kinds of things. And again, I would in all humility say that none of that was rocket science. None of that was particularly innovative. It was simply taking the sort of bread and butter basics of what other industries like FMCG have done over the last 10, 15 years and bringing that to a new set of customers, and in our cases, largely patients.
Fantastic. And this is also such a great example, Tariq, how sometimes, people are focused of hiring people only from similar industries, but you get so much when you're also looking outside and getting expertise from different industries and get what they've done over the years and implement in your industry. So thank you for sharing that example. Mike, how about you?
It's interesting, and I was saying before, as you're, what you're measuring and what's important to the customer changes. We had an example where we not only had to change our perspective of what's important, we had to make sure we communicated internally to our senior leaders that that's changed, and it was tough. It was almost more difficult inside than externally, because what do you mean case fill isn't the only measure that I should be looking at? Or yeah, well, we did that for a long time, but now, as there's inventory and trade and whatever, on time is their most important measure, and we got to make sure that when we balance what we do, we have to balance it this way. It's good because you're getting that feedback and you're adjusting quickly, but you can't do it in a silo or a vacuum. You have to make sure everybody understands that you've changed the focus or changed the balance. It's not that all the other measures aren't important. It's just the balance of what the customer says is preferred is where you're pushing.
So Mike, would you have an example on how you actually implemented that during your time with Colgate-Palmolive?
Yeah, I don't think we did. It's not that hard to implement. It's to change people's behavior, right? Because they're used to everyone was measuring on time. We were measuring all those measures, but we just had a preference or a push always towards trying to get case fill as high as possible. Once you get that feedback, that's what we put together, is making sure we got back out to customers and asked what's important. Then we moved, again, the balance another way. So, whether it was with, you talk about the big retailers, Walmart or Target, they're always changing what they're looking to get, because they're not only competing with themselves, they have consumers that change preferences. So it's really important to get that. And once we set up the teams to get that continual feedback, the what to do wasn't that hard.
Got it. And Sandra, from your side, concrete example of building customer-centric supply chains. We are getting a lot of questions from audience as well. So what I'll do after this is to ask question maybe from one or two panelists, and we
stuff, and you have to take a huge education step, which is what we did for 2 or 3 years. We had to go through this thing of, no, this is not a waste of time. If we get it right, the whole of the system will work really well. The problem is, and even when I left, we're still fighting that battle of change management, and people don't like change. And if it's not their change and you're changing something for them, and they're on the demand side of the business, they think, and they're in this story of, I need inventory, I need to be able to just have whatever I want and pick it off the shelf, you're never going to get the efficiency and effectiveness. So we spend a lot of time showing with actual data what this meant for us and what we could achieve. We moved forward in some places. Some regions accepted it better than others, but I wouldn't say it was a huge success everywhere, particularly in some of the more like North America, which tends to be, less open to change in that way. But that's what we did. We explicitly went out and did a bandwagon, created an organization and a bandwagon that basically would talk about the importance of customer service, what it meant, how you did it. And it isn't difficult. I mean, let's be honest, supply chain has a set of principles that you apply everywhere, wherever you are. How you apply them is the magic. But what you apply in terms of how you describe it is pretty straightforward and simple, although Tariq and Mike and I clearly are amazingly intelligent and all that sort of stuff, but it's pretty straightforward in terms of what you do. How you do it is the magic. And if you can get people with you emotionally, then you can change the world. That's what we did. We actually created an organization that focused on all of this and tried to bring the magic into customer service, and what we do with the consumer is absolutely the core.
Fantastic. Thank you very much for sharing that, Sandra. And I have a question from Tim Paulson. What are your best strategies for correlating customers' critical to quality items to actual performance in the supply chain? So, for example, do you bridge the gap from customers' demands to addressing these through better operations? So let's hear it from Tariq.
Sorry, I didn't quite catch the question, Shub. My apologies. Can you just state it again?
So how do you correlate customers' critical to quality items to the actual performance in the supply chain? Like once you've got what are the important items, how do you then translate those?
Do you mean things like if I take chocolate, how does it melt for the consumer? Do you mean that in terms of the critical to quality? Because I can see where Tariq might be confused, because there's critical to quality in the execution internally, and then there's critical to quality through packaging and other things externally. So it's quite it's a great question. It's a complex question in that way, though.
Got it. So, Sandra, I don't have access to Tim here, but what I can do is maybe we can take what we get out of the questions. You can focus on, since we are looking at customer centricity, we look at what's actually critical to the customer externally, and then we work our way backwards.
Well, look, I think Sandra, it sounds like she understood the question better than I did, so I'll pass it on to Sandra.
Thanks, mate. So I do think, Tim, that there are two categories of consumer of critical to quality. We have the internal ones, which, if I think of my career in FMCG, has all been about what the consumer gets as it goes through the process. So, for example, do I have the right moisture level in my chocolate? Do I have the right molecules level in my chocolate? Or do I have the right biscuit moisture in the biscuit? Those kind of things. And there are 2 or 3 crucial critical to quality metrics that you measure when you are going through the processing process. And then you have the critical to quality, and you get the feedback from panels and things internally more than anywhere else on that one. But you have to have the honesty and the openness to not mess about with the numbers, which I don't think the R&D people certainly don't do that, and they tend to own that kind of area. And then you come to the consumer piece where you get the feedback on packaging and things like this. And we do a lot of audits on the shelf around that. We introduced those actually about 3 or 4 years ago to do the critical to quality audits on the shelf with our consumers and get feedback from there. And that made a huge difference in terms of the robustness of the packaging, the sustainability of the packaging, and also the way you could use your packaging from a marketing point of view to basically advertise your product. And we often forget about the use of packaging, not just to protect the products, but also to advertise the product as well, to beat the people on the shelf who are your competition. I think that's maybe that's what Tim was after, but if not, Tim, come back and say. But I would put them into 2 categories, internal and external. But maybe Mike and Tariq would want to build.
If the question is the balance between product quality and service, which was kind of what we're answering, you have to adjust your supply chain to continue to meet the quality standard. There's no less, you're not going to shortchange the quality of the product. You have to change. So whether it's a refrigerated container or extra packaging to make sure, as Sandra said, it gets on the shelf, people can see the branding, it's not damaged. I mean, we all went through a issue when e-com started going, because our packages were not designed for that supply chain, right? So that's, to me, if the question is how do you balance that, you make sure the quality is right all the time.
Yeah, I would agree. I don't think there's any trade-off, right? It's not that you can balance sort of offset one versus the other, because if you, let's take the products on the shelf, quite often when you go into a supermarket, you'll see that what consumers have done is if there is a variability in the quality of the packs because some are torn or look like they've been damaged, those just get pushed to the back and they take the good stuff, right? So I don't think there's any trade-off. You have to, exactly as Mike and Sandra said, you have to get the quality right every time. And then the question is, how do you make sure you do that and have the product available on the shelf, when people are looking for it? But again, I don't think there's a trade-off personally there to be made.
No, it's a bit like safety. You don't trade off on safety ever. So you don't trade off on quality ever.
Quality ever. All right. Yeah. Good. Thank you very much for that. I have another question from another Tim. Tim Ackermans here is asking, because we talked about changing people's behavior and mindsets in one of the first questions. How do you actually bring about changing people's behavior versus the KPI culture, which we see in a lot of organizations these days? So,
I mean, that's an interesting point that, to me, you have to make sure people, are motivated properly, and that if you're changing what the motivation was in terms of the result, people look at KPIs as their own. Am I doing well, right? Mm-hmm. So you have to make sure that as that changes, there's still a way for them to do well and see it in a result. I think that's the thing that changes behavior. Behavior change is very difficult. It really is. And you think about it internally in work within the supply chain. Same thing with consumers. If you ever try to get them to use a product that you try to change the behavior, it's the hardest thing to do. So it's a constant feedback and a new set of, whether it's incentive or motivation, that people could see that, yes, this is a good result and feel good about it.
Yeah, and I think just to build on that, I would say that, if we're talking about any kind of transformation, whether it's process or getting people to work in different ways or different tools, there are two things I've always found important. One is making sure that they really understand why we're doing this, right? And I think quite often we focus too much on what we want people to do differently without having explained well enough why, right? And what's the benefit that this is going to drive to the final consumer, to the patient, to the customer, whoever your stakeholders are. And then importantly, also being able to articulate clearly enough what's in it for them as individuals. So they need to understand, I'm going to give up something and gain something, or I'm going to stop working in one way and you want me to work in another way, you want me to use this tool that I wasn't using before, or whatever it might be. But they need to understand why are they doing it and what does it mean for them? How's it going to impact them, and how's it going to make their lives to some extent simpler as they serve the consumers and customers, as Sandra had mentioned, very early on.
Yeah, and I think on that one, there's two thoughts I have on that. The first one about the serving the consumer and the customer and the mindset change that we've alluded to. And if you haven't got the mindset change in play, and you haven't got enough people, particularly non-supply chain leadership people, in play, you're not going to make it happen, no matter how hard you try. So then you want to pull back and regroup and look at a different way to make things happen. Otherwise, you lose your one option versus having more options to try and get this through. I learned really early on in my career that, pushing my brilliant idea through, it was brilliant to me, but it might not be brilliant to other people. And if you keep pushing your brilliant idea through, you become the problem versus the brilliant idea that you want to be as a solution. So I think that for me was a learning I've had around if I can't get the leadership team signed up, if you've got a huge mindset shift change you want to make, and I've had examples of that particularly in the last few years, you try and change something, but people aren't ready to give up their babies. They're not ready to give that. So you have to wait to the right time to be able to then come in. So patience, which I'm not very good at, but patience is something that's really important in these kind of roles, which is why you can't do them for 2 years at the top of the organization and move on. You have to build the whole foundation and everything else that moves on from there. And then the second thing I was going to say, but to help people as an example, is when I was in Kimberly-Clark, Mike was brilliant, and Mike came along to a Kimberly-Clark meeting that we had. It was the first one we'd had as a supply chain team. We didn't have a supply chain before my position came in. It had been manufacturing, and there's some bits around here, and finance is looking after procurement. And I asked Mike to come and talk about what he'd done in Colgate 10 years before and for those 10 years, because the transformation, I think the industry, certainly at that time, then the industry was very cognizant of how well Colgate were going. Your shares were off the everywhere. It was just brilliant in terms of what you were doing, Mike. And Mike very kindly came and talked about the journey that he and his team had been on, and the impact of that, because it's non-competitive for us. The impact of that on my team was massive. And we had about 400 or 500 people there who were talking about what we did. Bringing someone in who isn't people that they know, but in a well-respected organization, and having Mike sit there in a fireside chat with actually Kevin O'Mara. Kevin did the fireside chat with you and I, didn't he? And it was just the most brilliant conversation to make it real for people. And they all walked out zinging with, we can do this then, which makes a big difference. So I think communicating is really important, and finding different people who can help you take the system to think differently is really important.
Yeah. And that was a great example. And I remember, and things that I learned from that, when you want big behavior change, you have to make the message as simple as possible.
Yeah.
Because you're talking, a lot of people have to understand it. And so you can't put out there, as Sandra said, this complex, this is my baby thing. No one gets it, or half of the people don't get it. Make the message as simple as possible, and then be super consistent on that message.
And keep repeating it. And I've always been surprised as to how often you need to keep repeating it.
Oh my God,
to drive home.
Yeah, you feel like a parrot, don't you?
And Sandra, I'm going to do a very quick shameless plug-in here. But this is our learning solutions team actually does these external sessions for organizations to give them mega trends of what's happening, the macro trends, and what are different companies doing, in a way to inspire companies to think about how they are going about with problem solving. So, okay, end of the shameless plug-in here.
I think that's different though, Shub. I do think that's different. Educating people on how to is very different than having a great leader coming in from another massive company and just talking about what the experience has been. So I wouldn't bring the two together. I think what you're providing is brilliant too. And it's more of an education process in terms of, the kind of plan, source, make, do, deliver sort of thing. But this was more emotional. It wasn't necessarily, it was completely logical, but it was more emotional in terms of people feeling how it would be. And that's what's so important with mindset behavior change. People have to feel that it's the right place to go to. And Mike did a great job in helping my team, lots of them, understand what we were moving to. And bringing it to life. And yes, your element really does matter. And yes, Alcott Global do some fantastic stuff in that space. But this is bigger than that. This is the combination of the whole thing. I would just not to argue.
It's really, she's absolutely right in that I might have said this once before, but they knew what to do. You had to make sure they understood why we're doing it.
Yeah. No, I completely get it. And we do that element as well. But let me just take a great question, which I've just come across, where there somebody is asking, Paul Nestor is asking, any panel insights on joint problem solving with customers if service level declines, or if there is a supply chain service incident? How have you gone about with it? And how can organizations capitalize on coming together with customers to improve the overall customer service level?
Yeah, so I can give it a crack here. You have to be careful which customer, because some customers are allies, friends, want to be winning together, and some customers just want to screw you. You know, that's just how it is. That there's no way to pretty it up. So I think you have to make the right choices of who you work with, and then when you do work with the right, and you've built the relationships with your sales team and your supply chain team, you can work through anything. Excuse me. And actually, that's what we certainly, I'm sure the three of us have done that through the last 3 or so years with COVID and everything else that was there. You find different ways of doing things with the right customers who will work with you, and you set out, so you don't compromise yourself or your company or their company, but you set out the game plan of how you're going to make it work, and you have to stick to it. And that's the difficult thing. Some people just don't stick to it, and you get a side swipe in on, well, actually, I want to do this on Tuesday because it's just a really good idea. You can't do that kind of stuff. You have to have the discipline and the rigor around it. So that would be you can do it. I would say definitely do it. Make sure it's with the right customers and consumers to be able to do it, and measure your performance to show that you've done it.
Yeah, and just to build on that, if I think back to my P&G days, P&G, quite some time ago, just to reinforce Sandra's point, with key customers, they established embedded supply chain teams within the customer units, so that they were there close to the customer, seeing the problems, somewhat live, and then working in collaboration with the customer to solve those problems from a customer perspective. And then having those teams, in some cases small, in some cases with the likes of Walmart or Tesco's in the UK, quite big teams. That's a major change because they live, breathe, what the customer's seeing, the challenges the customer has day to day, and a much better place then to help jointly, first of all, find solutions, and then integrate back into the broader organization in P&G to make sure that those solutions get implemented.
You have to make sure you first get the facts, which are sometimes not so easy to get, the facts that they're agreed to. And then it just can't, and I think what Sandra's point is right, there are some customers that very much want to collaborate and are willing to do that. And if there's where you start and you have that, good relationship, you can do a lot of things. It's not you got to stay away from a blame game, which is easy to fall into. It wasn't me, it was you. It wasn't, you, it was me. And just, collaborate on the facts and make it better, because it's better for both parties.
Right. So I'm going to ask a question which most leaders have to be very cognizant of: balancing the demands of cost efficiency, especially in this year when we are talking about recession and inflation. So how did you balance the competing demands of cost efficiency and customer service in supply chain operations? Let's start with Tariq.
Look, I think if I think about it from a life sciences standpoint, which might be a little bit different, we didn't do a lot of that, because service and getting the medicines in the hands of patients is always priority number one. And if that means that you have to sometimes do things which might not be as cost efficient, like, for example, having to air freight medicines into a country, or air freight your raw materials to a site because you can't get the sea containers or whatever it might be, then that's just simply what you do. And I think, therefore, I would say that, look, service is the effectiveness measure, and efficiency and cost is an efficiency one, which, of course, we all need to work on. But ultimately, if you don't get what the customers want when and where they want it, then you don't have customers, you don't have revenues, and you don't have costs to worry about.
Yeah, I think I look at it a little differently. I think you have to separate cost from efficiency. So make sure you're still measuring throughput, you're measuring other things, and it was perfect in the last few years. The cost went up. That doesn't mean you still can't produce it efficiently, deliver it efficiently, make sure all those metrics that are not cost related, but more what I would call efficiency related are still focused on, because, when costs go up, it's like a fire drill. Everybody's alarm is going on, and it's easy to look away from your efficient operation to try to manage some of these cost parameters that are out of your control. So I think you have to. They're all important, right? At the end of the day, the total cost of the product is real important, and everyone needs to know that. But you still have to maintain your efficient operation.
Yeah, I think that's both points really well made there. And actually, I think some of the metrics that we don't look at, and you can't look at them every month, but things like, how much do I get out of my assets? What's my fixed asset turnover ratio? What's my current asset turnover ratio in terms of inventory and stock? We don't get intellectual enough around some of these, and they're not for every month, they're not for every week, but they are every 6 months to look at, am I getting what I should get out of my assets, which is really, Mike, I think where you go to with the throughput. We should be measuring how many kilograms or how many tons per hour we get, or per head. We need to look at that as well as the overall cost of what it is. And we should look at landed cost, because I think part of the question that's being asked also depends on the model and the network that you have. So if you've decided to be a big global business, and I think we've seen how that's worked in the last 3 years, and it works really well for some companies, and then it doesn't for others. Certainly in FMCG, and I guess, maybe more, Mike and I are more similar than Tariq would be in the pharmaceutical side of things, where you might be more, global in that way. But if you do it more locally, you have more flexibility, and you can manage your cost a little bit better because you're localized, unless you have some unique ingredient that you have to do. Whereas in a lot of the bigger ones, like, for example, when the semiconductors all went, it's still not recovered yet, but it's better than it was. When that happened, goodness me, China was at the forefront of everything, but we couldn't get what we needed to get, depending on which business you were in. So I think it depends, and you have to, again, you can't have one size fits all. You've got to be separate and independent around how your network runs and what you need to do for it.
Right, thank you. I have a question from Lassie, and he's moving the conversation a bit towards technology. So he's asked, if possible, to the panel to select one, what do you think is the most important enabling technology from a supply chain perspective to make step changes in continuing to deliver high-end customer centricity through global supply chain? So which one would you think is the most important enabling technology? Sandra.
So I've been doing a lot of work, maybe not quite so much now because I'm retired, but I've been doing a lot of work on things like machine learning and advanced processing, because I have in my mind, I don't know why we can't get to a place where we have a no-touch factory and a no-touch distribution center at some point or other. That doesn't mean you have no touch, but it means you have very, very limited touch, obviously, and ultimately try and get there. But you need your advanced process control work, your signals and your data coming back to you as efficiently and effectively as possible. So I would say APO is one for me, and then machine learning, so that you can rely on the equipment to learn as it goes. And remember the first time I came across this, I was fascinated about the fact how bots ate each other, until the strongest survived, sort of thing. And you go, how could that be? This is digital, but actually the concept is the same. The strongest bot survives, and you get the best amount of data that you can, sort of thing. So those would be the two that at this moment in time, and for the next 2 or 3 years, I think we really need to bed those in and try and get that usage into play for being able to turn the lights out in a factory. And we're getting there. We're getting to a place where we're in single digits of people running lines in big factories, but we're not there yet, and it needs more of that work, So that would be where I would go, very much in digital, APO and machine learning, which are probably, you can bring them together, can't you?
Yeah, I would agree with that, but I think the trick in it is the connectivity of all of it, right?
Yeah.
So how do I get it all these different enabling technologies connected so those smart decisions can be made autonomously and continue to flow? I haven't seen that code cracked yet, but there are a lot of people working on it.
I think you're spot
Yeah,
on.
I would agree with both Sandra and Mike, and then one of the things that I think is still missing a lot on the majority of supply chains is, to their point, that lack of connectivity end to end, and therefore the lack of visibility across the end to end. And if you don't have the visibility, then you can't, to use a Gartner term, you can't orchestrate it, right? I mean, how can you manage or orchestrate, whatever word you want to use, your end to end from your shelf back to your suppliers if you have no visibility on where your inventory is, how your production's doing, who needs what from a demand standpoint, and so on. And therefore, certainly over the last sort of 5 years at Sanofi, while we did a lot of work on various different technologies and tools, I think the one that certainly helped us the most was putting in place a planning system across the end-to-end that gave you that visibility and ability to orchestrate, and then be able to try and get the best out of that value chain or supply chain that you could. But I agree with everything Mike and Sandra said about that connectivity piece, and then leveraging AI, machine learning, and so on.
So I have a question from Vivian, and that's to your point, Sandra, that she completely agrees about patience being key when it comes to change management. But when there is urgency for the change, how can we accelerate the change in that scenario? So Sandra, maybe we'll start with you since it builds onto your point.
Yeah, so you make a crisis, basically. That's what you do in a controlled way. And actually, yes, I've done both of those things. The patience is more in deep mindset changes and behaviors. You have to work out what takes time and what's quick. If you have a crisis in the moment of having to quickly change how you approach customer service or how you approach service or whatever, or safety, any of these things, you don't mess about with that one, you call it. And actually, it's much more disciplined and rigorous and more of a tell. So that's one way of doing it. When you're trying to create an emotional change, that's different. You can create an emotional change with safety or quality because you've got a crisis. But if you're trying to change a whole mindset of how did you do something, then you have a different approach. So I would say when it's a crisis, you will behave differently anyway. That's what businesses do. But we love crises, actually, because we like running around like headless chickens and fixing it all and being heroes and heroines, but actually it's probably not the best way of being if you can get some stability in the place. So I would say it's horses for courses again. If you need to make it critical, you make it critical and you declare a breakdown.
Yeah, I would echo that, and I would just say a couple of thoughts on top. One is be very choiceful. I think too often people try to do too many things at the same time. So be uber choiceful about what is the one biggest change in behavior or mindset or whatever you want to drive. And then to Sandra's point, if you can artificially create a crisis if there's not one there, or at least create a burning platform that drives that sense of momentum and motivation that Sandra's talking about, then that's a big help.
Yeah, this is a favorite question for me because if it's a crisis, if it's a survival, situation or a business threatening situation, I've never seen an issue with urgency of people, never. But is it? I had an old boss who said, "Is this boss school?" So in other words, I want it faster, more, that's not urgent. All right. That's just, and that could be destructive too. If you start to push where you don't need to and get people to cut corners where they shouldn't. So you really have to make sure that you're urgent because there is a crisis.
And I think that's a really good point you make about cutting the corners, because if you create a crisis and it's a cost crisis, and you take the wrong things out, which we are very good at doing at times, you have a bigger mess than you ever dreamt of. And I think I've seen that. I think we've all seen that, where you go, well, the cost is the most important thing. No, there's a balance. Back to our conversation, goodness knows, all the way through. There's balance. You cannot possibly just talk about the supply chain as a cost bucket. I mean, we had that conversation years ago, didn't we, Mike and Tariq, with people that we know around the table. We're not a cost bucket. We are a function that has multiple different directions we can go in, and everything needs to come together. And if you just measure one metric, be it cost or cash, which people tend to do, particularly in the financial set of equations, and you need to mindset change and educate there. If you haven't done, you end up driving your supply chain into nothing, and it's not a supply chain. It's just a manufacturing unit that happens to buy stuff in and put stuff on the shelf if it can, So I think that's really important, that you don't cut your costs so much or in the wrong places that you end up having a problem later, and you end up with a food safety crisis or a human safety crisis,
Fantastic. Well, I can't believe we are almost reaching the top of the hour. So I want to just end with the final question today. What do you see as the future of customer-centric supply chains, and how can organizations prepare for the upcoming trends and challenges? So, Mike, let's start with you.
Yeah, the future, I think Tariq said it in the beginning, it's going to evolve. It's going to change. I don't think you should set up to try to predict the change. You need to set it up to be able to ingest the change quickly, enable it, and move forward again, understanding that will also change, right? This is now fast-paced. It's very volatile. The technology change the game, and there'll be more. So how do you get comfortable with change? I think is a real key to running a successful supply chain in the future.
Yeah, I would echo that. I think it's going to continue to evolve. I don't have a crystal ball, and I'm sure that nobody else does either. But what is clear, though, is that customer expectations are only going to continue to rise, right? So their expectations of back to where we started, what they want, when they want it, how they want it, and they want everything now personalized to them more and more. So all of that kind of evolution or trend that we've been seeing is only going to continue. And I think I fully agree with Mike. You should focus on, how do I stay close enough to my customers to understand those things and how that's evolving? How do I stay agile enough across my supply chain in order to be able to, ultimately adapt to that, and to continue to give the consumers and customers, and in my life sciences case, the patients, what they want? And that's probably the best way of continuing to survive and thrive.
Yeah, and I would completely agree with both Tariq and Mike. There's nobody can tell us where it's going to go, because we don't know where the consumers are going to go in the future. Yeah, we set ourselves these great measures for 2030 and 2050, but we don't know what was going to be like in another 25 years' time. Maybe some of us aren't here by then. We just don't know. So I think keeping a very open mind and a curious mind, being really curious about what's out there. People who stop pushing themselves to be curious about what's happening, or become manufacturing driven or logistics driven, people who do that are going to shut themselves off from what's coming, because the world isn't that way. It's not parallel running. It's all over. The things are connected everywhere, to the point about connectivity, which is really, really important. We can have as much digital as we can possibly want, but if we're not connecting it all to get the right places that we need to see to be able to have the view of where we're going, we're wasting our time completely. So I think it's going to get more exciting. It's going to get simpler because technology will become better in terms of what we're doing. And at the moment, we're probably at that bit where it's learning how to be something that we need. And actually what we needed to do is just to do what we need it to do. So I would say, you know, with some of the big companies that are around now that are technologically coming up, there's great partnerships there that we can form to be able to make that happen and really develop the right programs. But they're not going to be the end game. They're going to evolve, as both Tariq and Mike are saying, they're going to evolve as they go. So I think it's going to be an exciting journey. It's going to be the right journey because it's all about the customer and the consumer ultimately. And we should just be having a good ride on it, basically, and see what we can do to make sure that we can beat the competition, whoever the competition are, you know.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for sharing all this wealth of knowledge in the last hour. Thank you very much, Sandra, Mike, and Tariq. Really appreciate your candid conversation. Thank you to our viewers as well. You've given us a lot of questions. I'm sorry I could not get to all the questions, but we didn't have enough time. But I'll definitely reach back and see how we can get your questions to be answered. And then please do continue following us at Alcott Global, and you can also follow our panelists. Their profiles are linked in the post with which you're viewing this panel discussion today. Thank you all, and have a great day, evening, whatever you have now.